Well, thank you for joining us today. We're really delighted that you're here. So one of the things I wanted to do was just to get an idea of your career path and starting from when you left Eugene to where we are today, and just find out how that's been for you and your decision making along the way.
Okay, it's been a long and varied career path. We could be here for the next hour, so I'll try and give you the shortened version of it to some extent. Um, my first position after leaving here was at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. And I went down there to look at how people who have sign language as a first language process information, because my work here at Oregon had been about hearing people processing information. I was interested in whether the thinking processes were done differently for people who use signing a lot to think. And in fact, that going down to Salk was a direct result of something that I did here. My last year I took a course on applied cognitive psychology, and I thought, really? Applying cognitive psychology? I didn't that was really interesting. It had been very theoretical up until that point. And I just loved it. For my project, I got into looking at what deaf people were doing for communicating. And I ran across the work of a woman named Ursula Bellugi, who was at the Salk Institute, and she had sort of been the founder of really learning that American Sign Language was a distinct language, that it wasn't English, and it had all its own syntactic, grammatical markers. I wrote to her saying I'd really like to do a postdoc. Here's the kind of work I've been doing, and here's what I would like to do in your lab. And she took me. I got an NSF fellowship, and I got to work with her for a few years. So that was a magical time. Postdocs end, and I went out to Haskins Laboratories, which was it's a research lab at Yale University. And I'll be honest, I didn't look all over the world. I was looking only in certain places because I had met my future husband, and he was working out in New York. So I was really looking for something, like in the tri-state area. And I got this, which turned out to be very nice. So they did a lot of work on language processes underlying reading. And I went there, and they found me odd and interesting because they had this thing of speech is special, and I was working with a population that didn't speak. They were all signers. And they said, well, if they don't speak, they can't read, because everything that we've learned says that speech is the basis for reading. So that was really interesting. And in point of fact, they turned out to be largely correct. It's just that the type of speech that deaf people would do if they were very good readers was not spoken. They couldn't hear anything. They would base it in articulation. So I would interview some of these deaf people and say, well, what do you do when you read? And they would go, kind of a thing, So it was the articulatory counterpart of us kind of hearing a voice in our head, sort of, when we read. I was there for a couple of years. I was happy with that. And then this was another one of these personal choices. I had my first daughter. I was in New Haven. My husband was in Yorktown in New York. And we lived halfway in between, so that all sounded good. And then our daughter got really sick one day. She's at school, and we couldn't get to her. We were both like an hour away. I said, this is ridiculous. And I applied to IBM Research and got a position there, and we were able to move and all that. IBM was great for me. I worked there for more than 25 years. I started out in the education group, sort of continuing the work that I had done at Haskins and at Salk. I still got to work with deaf populations and look at reading processes, but the work became more applied. So rather than investigating the reading processes, I started developing software that would help with reading. Okay? Yeah. So you can see I'm kind of moving in a different direction at this point. It's related, but it's a different direction. And I did that kind of thing for a few years. And at that point, one of the VPs of IBM came to me and said, we really need to open up a group that does accessibility research, because government mandates are coming down now so that our software has to be accessible to people with disabilities. And you've been doing that work for a long time, so would you head that up? So I became manager of the accessibility research that IBM was doing. And that challenged me in a lot of ways, because I'd always been sort of specialized in working with deaf people and looking at sign language issues. And now I had the whole range of disabilities. But we did a lot of very interesting things, and I was very proud of it. One of the nice things we had was we did a lot of work with corporate community relations, which is the philanthropic part of IBM. So I got to have the fun of doing very worthwhile, socially redeeming projects and not have to worry about going out and marketing them, because IBM would donate them, the projects, to schools and senior centers and whoever needed them. And it had a very global reach. So one of the things we had to do was translate everything into multiple languages, because IBM also made it available to people around the world. So that was the IBM years. I was it was basically, I was sitting in my office one day and I got this call from a university in Scotland that did a lot of accessibility work. And they said, would you be interested in coming over here? You know, someone is leaving and we really need someone to do accessibility work. And I'd been to Scotland, I liked it. And I thought, hey, you know, how bad could that be? And I went over there and of course I loved it.
Sure.
And they offered me a job and it was just at the right time too, because my kids had both just graduated from high school, so I didn't have to worry about yanking them around. I went to Scotland, did an academic job, which I had always been interested in, but I had never had one. That was interesting because I had never lived in Scotland before, which has a very different educational system, and I had never been in an education environment at all. But anyway, so the only thing I had to draw on was my last education experiences at the University of Oregon. And let's just say the teaching was different in Scotland. But that was a very happy time for me. We loved Scotland. Both of my daughters went with us. One was in a graduate program there. She ended up getting her PhD in computing. The other daughter started an undergraduate program in music there. So the whole family was there. We loved it. I was very successful in getting grants, got to know a lot of people in the UK, got a lot accomplished, set up a center. And then my husband was still working for IBM remotely. And they said, you've got to come back to the United States. So it was one of these decisions of, you know, what are we going to do here? It's a real choice made. So we left Scotland, but I would probably still be there if IBM hadn't kind of made us come back. So when I came back, I chose to go to the Rochester Institute of Technology because they have the National Institute for the Deaf there. Right. So I was able to keep up a lot of my research programs going on. And a very long answer to a quick question, right?
You've had quite an impressive career, though. So.
Well, I've been a lot of different places. I don't tend to feel like I'm hopping that much, but it's been a long career.
Yeah.
So I stayed every place for several years. So I'd been at Rochester Institute of Technology for the last several years. And one of the things that I had done all my career was work as a volunteer for ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery. I'd been in a lot of different volunteer positions. I had started their special interest group on accessibility. I had started a journal with them on accessibility research. I'd eventually been elected to Secretary-Treasurer, Vice President, President. So I'd had this strong volunteer career, always in addition to the academic and industrial career. And just a year ago, the former chief executive officer at ACM retired and the position came open. I was president at the time and I figured, hey, who's more qualified than me in terms of knowing the business of the organization? So I threw my hat in the ring. I got the position, and so now I have left the academic career and I am full-time working for ACM. That doesn't, it's not like a business kind of a thing, though, when you say CEO in a company and this and that. It's really pretty much a full-time scientific endeavor now, because what I do is I represent computing to the external community, working with businesses and with government in terms of what computing is doing these days and making sure people know about our researchers and making sure that ACM keeps up to date on what is current in computing and offers the kinds of services, training and research conferences and things like that that people in computing need. And it's a global community. We have members in 199 different countries.
Wow.
So I spend a lot of time on the road.
Or in the air.
In the air, exactly.
Exactly.
Exactly. So that's where I am now. So it's been sort of a long and varied career, but it does all sort of tie together. Yeah. Just different ways of working on similar kinds of problems. Yeah.
It's really interesting, the theme of your work that carries through, regardless of what position you're in.
Right.
The theme is very clear.
Right.
That you've been doing this programmatic work in different settings. So when you reflect on those different settings, do you have thoughts about the pros and cons of an academic environment versus a more corporate, even though you're doing research in that position, but a more corporate type of position?
I get asked that a lot by people who, particularly students, who are trying to decide if they want an industry career or an academic career.
Right.
I don't think there's a hard and fast answer to that. It really, in large part, depends on you. So my husband has been with IBM forever, and he loves it and can't imagine a job in academia. I kind of always wanted a job in academia, but for various reasons, I said, the family constraints and this and that.
Right.
I was at IBM for 25 years, and I was happy. I really was happy. But when I got the offer for academia, I was thrilled, and that was just more me.
Right.
So I don't know how students really can test out those two things, but there's pros and cons to both of them. In academia, you get to work with some very interesting people. I already talked about maybe having a bit more freedom in academia to choose what you want to do. You can work with students. A lot of people get very, very excited about working with students and shaping future careers. But in industry, you do things on a large scale. So if you do something you believe in and the company distributes it, you get to really see the impact of potentially millions of people using what you work. So one of the things that I didn't mention was many, many years ago, when I was a manager, they came and said, this internet, we think it's going to be a big thing. So you can see how long ago this was, right? And the schools are going to want to use it, but they don't really know how to do it because they can't get connected. That was the day before we had these nice routers, and you just plugged them in and everything. Sure. Everybody could do a high-speed internet. So I was actually part of a project that figured out how to get one line into a school, plug it into a server, divide that up so that every student and every teacher could have their own email account, and they could get out on the internet. It was a lot slower. It wasn't really as nice as it is now, but so it was just really in the early days of getting the schools involved in the internet. And that product sold widely, So it is fun in industry when you do something like that and, make a big impact, more than I think most of us make as an individual researcher.
And one of the things that's really interesting to me about your career is that you have been able to move what seems from the outside very seamlessly between those two types of work environments. And I don't know that a lot of people do it as successfully as you have, and I wonder if you have thoughts about what made that successful for you.
Right. So somebody wrote to me not too long ago, and she was saying that she was someone I'd met when she was a postdoc, and she said, I've been in industry for a few years now. I like it, I'm doing well, but I know eventually I want an academic career. How long do I have until I can get one? Should I be looking right now, or can I wait another 10 years and get one? And that's an interesting question. I was at IBM Research. And in research, we had a dual mission, which was to do something for the company, but also to be scientifically relevant. So I was always part of that scientific community, and I had publications. So I think I could get hired because I looked sort of like an academic with the industry connections, which people always like because then you can talk to industry and but I think if you go straight into like maybe a small startup where you have to devote all your time to working on the product, it would be harder to get back into academia.
Right.
So I know why it worked for me. I don't have a magic bullet for other people.
Right.
It's sort of a charmed life being able to be in something like IBM Research. And the bigger companies will let you do that. Well, at least in computing. I can't speak for other disciplines, but in computing, the bigger companies let you do that. The smaller ones, it's much harder.
Do you find the skill set is any different? What skills you need to succeed in both academic and industry environments? Or do you think there's a common core that has helped you?
For me, there was a common core. I can imagine that there could be differences. For me, there was a common core, though. So academics write a lot of grants to get money, right?
Indeed.
Indeed, exactly. It's a surprise when people find out that in IBM I had to do that too. So I was a manager, I had a team of people, but I had to write a grant every year, not quite the same form, but I had to write a proposal every year to the different branches in IBM telling them why they should pay me for my people to keep doing that work. So the grant writing skills seem to carry to both. If you were the CEO of IBM, it's a completely different core of skills. You come from a business environment or something like that. But I certainly had a lot of transferable skills. Here I learned about experiments, how to conduct experiments. I may be conducting different experiments now, but I learned research methodology. In fact, that's what I taught all my years as an academic, and it was all based on how I learned to do research here.
So one of the things when I've looked at where you've been, one of the things that's striking is it appears to be a largely male-dominated field that you're in. And I wonder how you've navigated that to be a successful woman in that field.
Yeah. It is, depending on the statistics that you look at. In computing, it's something like 13 to 20% women. It's a very male-dominated field with a very leaky pipeline all the way along. So they've started looking at girls who start turning off at about age 7 from the math and the hardcore sciences, right? And by the time they're ready for college, there aren't too many who want to go into computing. And then some of them get lost along the way because they're in male-dominated classes. Graduate school is no easier. And then there's been a lot in the news this year about some of the companies haven't been very friendly to women, right, in computing. Right, so there's just this whole pipeline along the way. This isn't a satisfying answer, and I feel bad about it, but I had sort of the leaky pipeline. I remember in school I was very good at math, and I remember at one point everybody stared at me, and I thought, I can't answer those questions anymore, so I know the answers, but I'm not going to say them out loud. I'll just write them down, kind of a thing. So I understood that pressure. But when I got to undergrad, I had a wonderful psychology professor who hired me into his lab as a sophomore. It never occurred to me that I wasn't going to go to graduate school, and I got to be part of his publications as an undergraduate, worked with his graduate students, about half of which were women, so very supportive atmosphere. I didn't realize that was unusual. Then I came here with Mike Posner. I mean, you can't find a more supportive person in the world, so I didn't see that leaky pipeline. It was just, of course, assumed again that I would succeed and go on. When I did my postdoc at the Salk Institute, it was with a woman who had problems throughout her career, and she wanted to be a mentor. I was her first postdoc, and she wanted to talk woman to woman about how to survive, So she actually gave me tips, things that I hadn't thought about because I hadn't experience these kinds of things, It's just like, okay, these men are going to assert things. You just stand your ground, don't back down, kind of a thing. That was her philosophy, and she did it. So how did I don't know, but it is, I do hear lots of stories from the women in computing now and what they're going through. It's very tough. At ACM, we have a lot of projects to try and help like the students. So we have celebrations in computing where they can get together and talk about things. going to do that. But we have those. Well, I guess that's the main thing. We've had to come out with codes of ethics recently for how people should be treated at our meetings and any kinds of events, that kind of thing. We're very conscious of it, but it's a huge problem. Nobody has been able to solve the leaky pipeline. We and many other organizations in computing do a lot of work to try and encourage, starting with the girls to the undergraduates, graduate schools, and the numbers just really aren't improving at all. I wish I knew what to do to make that better. So not a satisfying answer, as I said.
I think it's a big question.
Exactly.
Too, that we may not have an answer to right now.
Right.
Do you remember the tips that you received from your mentor
was
besides
trying to-
assert yourself?
Yeah, I wish I had written those down because in the past few years, being particularly president of ACM and now the CEO, people always want me to give talks to women's groups about this, and I don't have the great tips. I'm like, what are those tips? I wish.
What were they?
No, the assertiveness is the one that I remember. Because at the Salk Institute, you had very famous people there, like Francis Crick was there and Jonas Salk was there at the time. And I'm not saying they were pushy, but I'm just saying they were very big names who were there at the time, right? And she just had to learn to stand her ground. She was going to fight for her lab and her funding and her people and this and that. So, yeah.
And interestingly, one of your daughters went into
the
same field. So, have you had talks with her about these issues and what she faces?
I have. So she, before I say that, so I think the crowning jewel, whatever, the highest achievement in my career is that she and I are now doing joint work. We've had 2 papers come out this past year, and she's been on maternity leave for the last few months, so it's a little slower now, but she's going back to work in a few weeks, and she's okay, Mom, so are you ready to go now?
That must be so great.
That is very exciting, yeah. So maybe in part I can't remember the problems I have because she's going through I've got the 2 kids and how do I do everything? I've got a job and her husband takes care of the kids, but still, she comes home and there's this to do and that to do and it's just hard. So she's been trying to network with other people in her area and figure out what to do. I had her go to one of these events that ACM has, and that was actually very helpful to her because she thought she was the only one who was having these problems, that somehow she wasn't coping very well, rather than realizing that it's just hard, And I guess I went through that, but maybe I was so busy that I can't remember anything.
It is really interesting with, you mentioned moving a couple of times for personal reasons or for your spouse's career and making that choice. And I wonder if you've reflected on how you balanced all of that, how you did that decision making in a way that obviously was very positive for you.
Right. We made a conscious decision on trading off how things were going to balance out. So when it was clear that it wasn't working for me to be in New Haven and him to be in Westchester County, I said, okay, I'll apply to IBM. This wasn't what I had really wanted to do because I told you I always thought I would have an academic career. I said, okay, the next move is yours. So when the Scotland move came up, he would have been happy to stay exactly where he was, but it was my turn to, this is what I want to do. Now's my time for the academic move. So that was how we balanced it out. I don't know if everybody else can. There may be different family dynamics going on, situations, but yeah. And then obviously the coming back from Scotland was for him. So maybe this last move was purely for me. Doing ACM, that was purely for me. I know.
So let's talk a little bit about your time here. When you were at the university, when you were living in Eugene.
Yeah.
What do you remember from the time when you were a graduate student? What sticks out in your mind?
So this is very funny. We worked. We just worked. I mean, this is terrible. We had a very nice cohort. There were 10 in my class. And we got along great. We did hang out together to some extent, but mostly we were downstairs in the cognitive lab, downstairs in Straub Hall at the cognitive lab working. And one of the things I found out after I graduated was this movie, Animal House, came out. And it was filmed in Eugene. I said, really? I missed the entire filming of the movie. I was so clueless what was going on.
Spending too much time in the basement.
Yeah. I was very motivated to graduate. I had 4 years of funding. I was going to be out of here. So those were the main memories I do remember from time to time. I would drive out to the coast, and I always loved that. But I don't know, we just really worked.
Yeah.
And we loved it. It wasn't like this was some kind of sacrifice or anything. We really enjoyed it, and we were all down there, so there was great camaraderie. Another big memory that I have was every Tuesday night, Mike Posner had meetings at his house. We all got one beer, walked in the door. But it was a place where you could really try out your ideas. So if you were just thinking of doing a study, you could kind of explain what you wanted, and people would be very helpful in, well, maybe why don't you try this, or think of this, or did you know about such and such kind of a thing. When the work got more developed, you'd collect data, you could come in and show it and say, here's what I think about it, and people would offer other suggestions. You get a little further and you had the paper written up, and people would make comments on the paper. So it was a very good way of learning all the way through. We had, so the graduate students more or less at my age, so there were some that were a few years older, and I mean, he just had all of the classes in cognitive psychology come. He had a lot of postdocs who passed through, a lot of visiting dignitaries. It was just a wonderful experience every Tuesday night at the Posner House.
Right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a few minutes ago one of the skills that you learned when you were here that you carried with you is how to do research. So basic methodologies and understanding research. Are there other skills that when you reflect back on your time here that you can see carried forward in your career?
Well, that's probably the main one. I mean, does just the general scientific inquiry and here's what you do as a researcher. That's a little different than designing experiments, I guess, but that's probably the main one. So in terms of the very specifics that I learned about cognitive psychology, I don't use those papers anymore, probably, sadly. But I do carry with me, here's what scientific inquiry is all about. And I think that's in part why it was very easy to transfer over into being more computing. I should say that I had done computing before. I did some as an undergraduate, and I came here, and as part of the PhD requirements at the time, you had to take a foreign language. I don't know if you still have that, but computer science counted as a foreign language. Okay, so that was my foreign language.
Yes, that's what many of us did in graduate school.
Okay.
Fortran.
Yeah, so it's funny, when I tell people that, they usually laugh. I don't think this is universal that computer science counts as your foreign language, right? But I did that. And all of our work in the cognitive lab was done on computers. So I had a lot of experience in that. And then when I went to the Salk Institute, in my particular lab, I was in the Language and Cognitive Studies lab, and they hadn't had a computer. And I said, well, I don't know how to do work if I don't have a computer to program the studies on. And she said, okay, buy a computer. So I got this little computer, and I started programming experiments on it, and people said, oh, that's really sort of cool, you know? And then they started buying them all over the place, and the computers got bigger and bigger, and things like that. Anyway, so that was a little off topic, but I think it was the whole scientific inquiry, just how to think about things, you know, what, I guess that's it, you know, where do you start with the work? Well, you got an idea, but then you go out and research what everybody else has done, kind of a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to think about that as the process of how we do our work, and the content largely is the part that if you know the process, you can do.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's just interesting.
Yeah, right, so I kept that as a core, yeah.
So I know that we've talked a couple of times about the impact that Mike Posner has had on your career. Can you talk a little bit about the influence he's had on you professionally, the role he's had in your life and your career?
Oh, you don't want me to cry, do you?
No, no cry, no cry.
everybody said, you know, how supportive he was as an advisor, and he's just, over the years, I guess it's turned into more of a friendship because he doesn't have to grade me or anything
Right.
like that, or tell me about deadlines for getting things done anymore. But he's just such a lovely person, and it's an example of what a human being can really be like. Yeah,
It's a lovely thing to say. It's a lovely thing to say about someone. I also, his work has been so influential
Yes.
in the field
yes,
too. So there's both that combination of just the scholastic excellence
right.
that he models, as well as the sort of human qualities that he brings to.
Right. So his when I was here, he was very interested in. I guess he's still interested in attentional processes, but he was doing it very much from letter matching. I don't know if you've known as letter matching. So he used to make a joke about he was famous for inventing the uppercase letter. You know, so you look at matching upper and lowercase. You know, that's tell you everything that you needed to know about the brain. About my second year here, he started getting interested in the neuroscience, and I did not follow him down that area. That was probably a mistake, given the importance of neuroscience now, right? But that's when he started going up to Portland and doing all the research with the hospital up there and this and that. So at least in my mind, his biggest impact has all been in the neuroscience field, which I don't follow as much, but that's where he's won all his awards. I mean, like every award, including the medal from President Obama. You know about that, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Isn't it an amazing person? And he's so humble. You would never know that he had done all of this if you just talked to him.
Yeah. So are there other people here that, I mean, obviously he has a massive impact on your career, your trajectory, and just, it's obvious when you see just socially, the two of you, that you're very close, just over time, that's maintained. Are there other faculty that you, when you reflect back on graduate school, that had an impact on you, an impact on your career?
Yeah, so we had an outstanding faculty that aren't all here anymore, but there was certainly Wayne Wickelgren and Doug Hinsman were in cognitive psychology, and Steve Keel was probably the next closest person that I worked with. Yeah, so he supervised me on all my projects too. Also a lovely person with great ideas and exactly the same kind of thing. You would never know that he was the amazing scientist he was, because he was so humble and said, well, maybe you want to try this kind of a thing. Yeah. Yeah, so Steve Keel would be the other person who was very, very influential in my life. Yeah.
How about the university? When you come back to visit, I know that you've visited a few times.
Yeah.
How's it changed?
It's got Nike here. I couldn't believe when I was here, certainly the Ducks didn't do anything except in basketball, I guess. They were good in basketball. But then I came back and we got this Nike thing, and now, you know, the football and the everything, it's just amazing. It's the sports campus and so it's bigger. It's been made bigger by the whole sports thing. That's the thing that just shocked me when I came back. It's like, really, they're in the Pac-10 now? They can do all this? Wait, I was here in the days when Steve Prefontaine was around, you know, so him running around, I mean, that was a big deal. They go, Pre. It's gotten a bit bigger in sports now.
Yes.
I assume there's a lot more students, but I haven't followed all that. But the noticeable thing when I come back is just the huge new buildings that have expanded in relation to sports primarily, is my understanding. I've heard that there's also going to be a number of academic buildings that are starting up, like in applied science. Right, but I haven't seen that yet, so that hasn't touched me yet. It's the sports that I notice when I come back.
Yeah. So what about Eugene? How is it living here back then? How has it changed?
Well, as I've already admitted, I don't know how much I lived here. I was here.
The basement part.
Yeah, right. You know, in many ways, it's so familiar coming back. So much of it has not changed. But then every so often I run into something that's completely different. It's like, this is something out of time. I don't know what it is. But I guess you have that experience most everywhere, although this place more than many others. A lot of it is still locked in what it was like 40 years ago. Yeah, particularly around the university area. Well, they have the same houses. Haven't knocked down all the houses by the universities to build fancy high-rises or something like that. I went to the University of Colorado as an undergraduate. Boulder's unrecognizable from when I was there, right? This is really pretty much the same by and large. And I'm sure there's, major new suburbs I know nothing about and things like that. But and some of the same stores are still here, which is unusual. Businesses tend to come and go. But,
So what was your favorite thing about living in Eugene and when you did get out of the lab?
Favorite thing? I don't know if I had a favorite thing at the time. Strangely, I liked the weather. People kept saying, how can you deal with the weather? I was happy with the rain. I didn't get cold. I didn't get hot. I was happy with that. But that's sort of a silly answer. My favorite thing about living in Eugene? The people here are very nice. They really are. Having lived in many different places now, there's something special about living here. I'm very comfortable here. I would love to be here again if I could. But I was mentioning that to you earlier.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is probably hard, but one of the things I wondered is if you had advice for current graduate students about the decisions they make, about making decisions about career paths, about just sort of how to succeed in the ways that you've been successful.
Yeah. This is the first part is not an answer to how to succeed, but I think it is the case that whatever they do at the beginning is not what they're going to end up doing in 10, 20 years. So there is a need to, the world is just changing so fast, and you're just going to have to be flexible and move on, and they will see lots of other exciting opportunities along the way. Certainly in computing, that's what we tell everyone. That may not apply to all of the sciences, but certainly in computing, the things that are hot now are not going to be hot in 10 years.
Right.
So it's a process of continual learning, continually evaluating what the options are. And also, people who are getting out of school now don't tend to look for a lifetime career. My husband has been with IBM since he graduated from here. I doubt that any of your graduates next year will stay in a job for the rest of their lives, right? So you do need the basic skills to be able to move, but also just constantly updating your skills and finding the next thing that interests you as you come along.
I like good advice.
Oh, okay.
Thanks. Really good. So one of the things you just said made me wonder, are there current events that you find you have to respond to from your profession? And I know that we talked about the women in computing issue. Do you find that across your career you've had to stay attuned to those in any particular way so that you are responsive to current events or events that happen in society?
Yeah. So actually, that's an excellent point. So having been with ACM in multiple roles over the years, people were always looking at technical things. How do I update my technical skills to move to the next hottest technical thing? What I'm hearing from people now is that they're really interested in ethical choices. They want us to do more in terms of stepping up and talking to the government about how to use technology responsibly. They want us to do more about talking to the popular press to get the general public to really understand what technology is doing. And the feedback we're getting from the new generation of computing professionals is, we want you as a computing society to be socially relevant to us. We don't care about just developing our technical skills. We want something that we can believe in. So that is a big, big shift now. Even the older people, I should say, not old, but even the ones who've been, say they're 50 years old, even they are starting to say ethics are what's really important to us. We have to pay attention to the ethics of technology development.
So how do you stay on top of those?
Well, I got lots of people who send me cards and letters. My email address is easy to find. So it's pretty easy. But one of the things I did this year was go on sort of a listening tour. I didn't call it that at the time, but kind of a listening tour. Went around to various of the big technology cities in the United States. Went to our group in Europe. But we have councils in different parts of the world. So I went to our council in Europe and said, what are the issues for you? To India, to China, our different councils. And really just paid attention to what they said were the important things for them. And I was expecting that they were just going to tell me what technical areas they thought was important. Right. But it turned out that this ethics was the number one thing mentioned by everybody. Also, the next highest mention really was doing interdisciplinary work. So this is new too, that they don't want us working in silos anymore. They talk about how they have to work with other disciplines, and they're working with very different disciplines. So they want us to work with the social sciences. We're starting up a new effort in computer science and law, and those kinds of things. So it's yeah. Think of health. I mean, that's a big one that would come to everybody's mind. But they had many efforts that they wanted us to do. I guess we're just tired of talking to each other. So,
I do think that's been an interesting evolution.
Yeah, right.
Sort of that interdisciplinary mode, but also our idea of education used to be that we were sort of sheltered from some of those issues.
Right.
And that was the advantage of academics in some ways, is that you're in that bubble and you're there to generate knowledge. But the impact of that knowledge is more obvious than ever in some ways.
Right. So what people still want to have the training in a particular discipline. It's just that then when you go to solve the big problems, and so people again are interested in societal problems, right? Saving the earth, the environment, saving people in starving countries and things like that, right? When you go to solve these big problems, it requires more than just what the computer scientists can bring to it, and more than maybe just the sociologists can bring to it or something. So they really feel that they need to have this big interdisciplinary team and look at all different perspectives. One of the most interesting things I've done in the last couple years is have ACM sponsor something called AI for Good. It's put on by the United Nations in Europe, and they have these sustainable development goals that they talk about, so solving the big problems of the world. And they bring together not only people from around the whole world, but they bring together people from every discipline you can imagine. So anyone who talks, you get up and say, here's how I think we can apply artificial intelligence to deal with issues of world hunger. And then somebody from another discipline will say, well, here, but you have to think of this, and then you have to think of this, and you have to think of this. And it's really fascinating. And I do think that's the only way we're really going to address some of the big issues, is getting everybody together and talking through it.
Right. That is exciting. It's an exciting idea that the big issues can drive us forward.
And now we really have people who want to do it. I can't speak for exactly what happened in the old days, but certainly in computer science, I think there was a lot of theory driven. We still need theory, but now we've got a lot of people who are really problem focused. That's what they're caring about.
Yeah, which also speaks to those skills you mentioned a while ago, the ones that each professional brings, and that common core of skills that allow people to think and creatively solve problems, and then come together with their disciplines represented in some ways. So.
Yeah, one interesting thing there will be funding sources, how to make this happen. Yeah, so when I was in the UK, I was on some interdisciplinary teams, and that worked great. We were able to get funding sources to do that. However, in the UK, they have this assessment mechanisms for all the universities. Oh, you're nodding.
Yes,
You've heard
I
of
know,
it? Yeah, so that each discipline has to have the faculty members submit papers, the best examples of your paper. But that paper primarily gets evaluated by people actually in your own discipline, and if it's interdisciplinary, it's very hard to get it fairly evaluated. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to come up with the metrics, the funding.
Yes,
I mean, those are all
exactly.
big issues.
Right. But people do want to figure out how to do that. And from my local ACM perspective, we want to put on events that are interdisciplinary. But then you start getting the people together, and they all have sort of different ways of working. So computer science is lucky in that we tend to have more money than, say, the humanities, because there is a lot of funding for it, and we do work a lot with industry that's doing well, right? So we tend to put on these very big, elaborate events. And so you get someone from an English department, you know. It's not the same rewards in terms of publishing. It's different. So in computing, we do conferences and publish those proceedings because things change so fast that people want the conference, and 6 months later it's published, and that's it. But that doesn't work for other disciplines who need the journals. So we're trying to work through what the issues are to really do the joint work that would help people with their tenure process. You know, ultimately people need to do the tenure process.
Right.
Yeah.
So where do you see your discipline going? I mean, we talked about the interdisciplinary, the big problems. Is there a path that you envision through that for the next, say, 10 years of your career?
Oh, you know, they didn't ask me that question when I got interviewed for this new job. Say a tenure path. I think 10 years is a very long time to project what the field is going to be. Right now, the only things that you really hear very much about are data science and artificial intelligence. I come from human-computer interaction, and that's actually very big. A lot of people are still getting hired jobs in user experience and HCI because the companies are realizing they have to create usable things. But certainly all the buzz these days is about artificial intelligence, its various subcomponents, and data analysis, data science and its components. 5 years ago, that wasn't the case.
Right.
So that's, you know, what is going to be the big buzz in 5 years? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Scientific publishing is the thing that keeps me up at night, if you're wondering what I worry about in 5 years for my current job. Because we're a huge publisher. And you probably know about the open access that's going on now. Right.
Sure.
And since we're an academic publisher, we don't charge as much as the commercial publishers, but we still charge. And for those people who don't like the idea of paying, it's a problem. So we have some very real issues to deal with in the next few years about that. That is my personal biggest problem. That's not a big problem for the whole scientific field, but as a society, we have to deal with that because people like the fact that we publish. We're a premier publisher for computing. And we keep pointing out that that isn't free. You know, people say, well, it's, you know, it's just on the internet, so it's not that. No, somebody's got to have the servers. They got to maintain the servers. They have to write all the software that keeps things working. There's a whole process.
There's an intellectual contribution too.
Yeah, so that isn't free, but then who's going to pay for it, you know? So we have some very real issues to work through on that level.
It is interesting. The technology produces those very real issues. As you get more technologically sophisticated, you discover new issues that you then have to deal with. And so,
yeah. Well, again, times change, you know. Well, 5 years ago, people were talking about open access. 10 years ago, they weren't talking about open access, but 5 years ago. And now it's a huge issue, and I understand it. The funders have said, look, we're paying for the research, and we want it to be available to everyone, right?
Of course.
I understand that. But it still costs us money to publish them.
Indeed.
So
Indeed. And all those strong skills that you learned here, you need to get compensated for. So before we wrap up, I just want to express my appreciation for your being here.
It's a pleasure.
For sharing your thoughts about your career and experiences and going forward. Are there things that you wanted to tell us that I haven't asked about?
No, actually, I don't think so. I will point out that I had an extremely beautiful 4 days here. The weather really cooperated, so I want to thank you for ordering the weather for me.
Indeed, best we could do.
No, I don't think so. I'm just here to, you wanted to know about career changes and
Yeah.
how that might help. So I think we covered all that. I don't think I
Perfect.
have any new insights in the last couple of minutes.
Excellent. Well, thank you. We
Sure.
appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah.